Welcome to the Silver Screen Guide podcast, where we discuss films from every genre. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the podcast. Sometimes dead is better. Today we are discussing Pet Sematary. No, not the new 2019 remake, but the 1989 film written by Stephen King himself. This is your co-host, Corbin.
I'm Allen, and yeah, new Pet Sematary comes out in I think a week after this recording goes live. So yeah, I think I saw April 4th, I believe is the release date, April 4th or 5th. So 1 week after this.
Which is kind of cool because this film came out 30 years ago.
That's right, yeah. I guess it did come out 30 years ago. It's getting quite old.
It's getting quite old. We're not quite as old as it, but I'm close. I'm closer than you are.
Yeah, you're definitely closer.
So it's not good. But the book this is based on a book of the same title, Pet Sematary, the book was released in 1983. As I said, the film was in 89. Now, I did read the book for this recording.
And are we going to wait for that until we get into the review?
I will wait to talk about similarities and stuff, but overall, I really enjoyed the book.
Okay. All right.
I don't think I've read a Stephen King book that I haven't enjoyed, because he is such a great writer. The only one that I actually haven't finished that I started about a year and a half ago, and it's only 200 pages long, is The Gunslinger, his very first book. And he even admits in that book, hey, I wasn't as good of a writer back then, and I kind of didn't really know what I was doing with this story direction-wise anyway. So that's the only one. Otherwise, I love reading his books. I own quite a few of them, and I haven't even read all of the ones that I own. There's 4 or 5 of them that I haven't even read yet, so I'd like to. But right. I had never read Pet Sematary, and I had only seen this movie one other time many years ago. Have you ever seen this movie, Alan?
I have not. I've definitely heard of it, but I haven't ever sat down to watch it until, I guess, now. I think the only, connection I have with it is I listened to part of the review from Now Playing, because I know that they did one over this, and I didn't listen to the whole thing because I think I got into spoilers, but that's about as far as my knowledge goes, aside from just knowing that it exists, and that's a Stephen King adaptation. So
you're new to it more so than but I didn't really remember anything about this movie. I remembered one character in this film, and I also remember the big scene, kind of the pivotal scene of this movie. I kind of had flashes of that. That's a little hard to forget. I won't give away any spoilers, but when you have events based around a child in such a way, those are always kind of hard to forget, especially in movies.
Right, yeah. So, yeah, I guess somewhat we're kind of new to this, although you did end up reading the book before watching it again, so you do have a little bit of foreknowledge as to, for most likely, what's going to happen in this movie.
Yes, and I was really hoping that this movie would stick close to the book, because I did love the book so much, and the storytelling. Of course, Stephen King writes really dynamic, intimate characters, but I was hoping that this would follow along fairly closely. Now, if it did or not, well, you'll have to wait till after we get after the spoiler warning. After we get past the spoiler warning. Now, they did make a sequel, actually, to this movie. The sequel came out 3 years later, and it actually retained the same director.
Really?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Mary Lambert, she hasn't done a lot, but she did direct this movie, and she had Stephen King write it. Stephen King did not write the second one. There are many sequels based off of Stephen King books. I think they're on Children of the Corn 10 by now or something.
Something like that, yeah.
And King has no involvement with those whatsoever. So I don't really consider those are, if anything, more so fan fiction. I don't really consider those a part of King's oeuvre or really canonical with his like thoughts about characters. Right. It was kind of odd because the sequel was written by Richard Oughton, and that was the only film he ever wrote before or since.
Huh. Well, I mean, I saw that there was I guess a sequel when I had looked at this in like the recommendation section of IMDb. So until today or yesterday, maybe, I didn't realize that there was even a sequel out. But that does, I guess it's not too big of a surprise because I did see the IMDb score. It's like a 4.5. Mm-hmm. That their writer didn't really end up going on to do anything else. So whatever.
Yeah, that score is interesting. I did watch the movie. I watched both of them, actually. And for those of you who are Amazon Prime subscribers, you can watch both films right now with your Prime Video subscription. I know that's the way that I watched them, so it was pretty convenient that way.
I knew the first one was on there, but I didn't realize the second one was on there. Interesting.
Yeah, and I'll just give, I guess, my brief thoughts over the sequel. I am kind of a sucker for 80s B horror movies, especially as something fun to do on a summer night. I kind of opt for some lesser known horror movies that aren't necessarily as good, but they're just kind of weird enough that they work. This almost gets to that point for me, especially the first half of the movie. I was fairly into it. It was kind of interesting and decently well done. But the third act is where it completely lost me, and I ended up just not finishing it because it was going on far too long. It was like a 30-minute climax.
Oh, great.
Now, that will work in something like The Lord of the Rings because that's epic, but this isn't. And they just really kind of lost the whole pacing, and at that point, I just didn't really care. I totally lost interest, so it went off into some really unbelievable places that I just couldn't track with. When you start to have, there's a dream sequence where this guy thinks that he is making love to his dead wife, but she gets a fake dog head because they're taking care of this dog that comes back, and then it turns into the dog head, and then it turns into the dog. That's where you start to lose me. Not a really fun sequence to sit through. And it's a bit graphic.
That sounds kind of interesting just by how insane that, from what I'm hearing here.
It is. They've got this really horrible fake dog head that they just, made up. It's like a mask, but it's supposed to be real, and it's like, it looks a little bit better than a mask, but oh gosh. And
that's hilarious.
You should, I challenge you to listen to the soundtrack for Pet Sematary 2.
All right.
It is weird. Not that they just play some kind of immoral rock and roll style music with some bizarre lyrics, but there's kind of this main theme of it that I do actually like, but it just doesn't seem like it fits with the movie.
Gotcha. All right. I'll have to look it up then.
So I guess ultimately, as you can tell by me shutting it off, I can't necessarily recommend the sequel. I don't know if it completely deserves that low of a score on IMDb. It's more so just a mediocre movie than like a real piece of trash. And maybe if it wasn't so late at night, I would have stuck through to the end, but I was pretty tired watching it that late, so that could have hampered some of my interest as well. But moving along, I did want to also mention that the director, like I said, is Mary Lambert, and I actually have seen one of her other movies. Like I said, she hasn't done much, but I did see her direct Halloween Town 2 Calabar's Revenge, which was a Disney Channel original movie. I don't know if you have any familiarity with that, Alan.
I know of Halloween Town, the two movies that are out. I think there's actually like spinoffs as well, but I haven't. Okay, yeah, have seen pieces of the first and second, but not enough to really, I guess, remember what they're about. Aside from, I guess, just looking at the plot summary on IMDb. I know that they exist, but I haven't ever sat down to watch them.
Sure. If you want something fun to watch around Halloween time with your family, especially like younger kids, then Halloween Town is a safe bet. And the second one, Calabar's Revenge, is probably the better of the two. So,
gotcha. All right.
Now, it is interesting to note that this book is deeply personal to Stephen King, and he also believes it to be his most frightening work he has ever written. And let me explain that. Frightening not in the sense as scary, because most of his readers would agree that The Shining is his scariest work. The reason he says this is his most frightening is because he is basing it off of personal experience with a twist. Where the Creed family lives and the active roadway that goes along, that is directly based from Stephen King's life. He packed his family up, moved up to this town in Maine, and this is all shot in Maine. It's based in real towns in Maine. Stephen King grew up in Maine. Like most of his books take place in the state of Maine, and those are real cities and towns. Well, he lived there with his family, and he had 2 young kids. And his daughter had a cat. I can't remember if the cat's name is the exact same name from this book, but they do, like some of the things the daughter said about the cat, he directly transplants those into the book. And we kind of get some of those quotes here in the movie. He also had a young son, and they lived by this really active roadway. And he was told that a lot of pets were killed on this road. And then he thought, what if we were playing out in the front yard and, I accidentally took my eyes off my son for a second. Like, what if that happened and he died? So he started writing a book based upon that. And it was just like too kind of overwhelming for him. It was like I said, too frightening for him. So he was originally not even going to release this book to the public.
Interesting.
But he was departing with his current publisher, and he still owed them one more book. And he just so happened to have Pet Sematary lying around for a while. So he's like, okay, I already have this book written. I guess I'll go ahead and give it to them, even though I'm not really too happy about it. So we were originally never intended to read Pet Sematary. This was kind of his own exercise in fiction that he ultimately just found to be too much, but he did end up releasing it. So kind of one of the more interesting histories surrounding his book.
That's interesting, because, I'm sure that multiple authors have multiple books they have that they just are never going to release. But that is interesting that Stephen King almost didn't release Pet Sematary, because I know that the movie is pretty popular because, part of it is because he's Stephen King, but on the other hand, too, it's also somewhat of a classic in terms of 80s horror now.
Oh, yeah. This is definitely one people think of and cite, and you hear little references to throughout the years. And it came at the very tail end of the 80s. It came out April 21st, 1989. Which was kind of the sweet spot, which was a really nice idea to release it then. It did have a budget of $11.5 million. It made back its budget and then some opening weekend with number 1 at the box office at $12 million. It went up against almost nothing of note that hadn't already been there for quite a while, such as Major League, Say Anything, The Dream Team, which is a Michael Keaton movie that I love, and Rain Man. Rain Man was number 5 at the box office, but it was in its 19th week.
Gotcha. Yeah, the only other movie that I could think of off the top of my head that I know comes out in '89 is Back to the Future Part 2, but that wasn't released until late November, so that's not really even much of a competition, I guess.
No, I guess not. But the film would go on to gross $57.5 million. So
that's good.
It did really well for itself.
Yeah, it did do well because I know we've talked about this before. Where usually, if you make your money back opening weekend, then you're set for a good trek. This made almost fourfold of its original budget, which is really good.
Oh yeah, it did very well, and you want to make a profit. You want to make that money back. Plus, you would hope to at least double it to make it worth it, and it did. So it did really pay off. But did it pay off with audiences at the time? Well, CinemaScore, which is kind of the preferred method because it does gauge people who have actually seen the movie. They're coming out of the theater and they're asked to rank it on a A to F scale with pluses and minuses in between. Audiences gave this film a B.
Well, that's not too bad. I mean, it's definitely, from the movies that we've reviewed that have a CinemaScore, we've kind of noticed that if it's usually above a B plus and maybe a B, then it's considered, I guess, good because most movies tend to be that way. And then anything below that is typically not good.
Yeah, this is kind of in the okay range. This is in the fine range. Yeah, it's a fine movie. Sure. Yeah, it was decent enough. Nothing to write home about. But clearly audiences kept coming back to see it, probably for good reason, because some of the stuff is pretty heavy or just kind of traumatizing. Just places you wouldn't have expected to go and see in a horror movie. So it was kind of, it had a lot of buzz. I will note that the sequel is also on CinemaScore, and it also got a B.
Okay. That's an interesting score.
Audiences thought exactly the same of both movies. Now, as for IMDb, it holds a 6.6, which is mediocre.
Yeah, that's a bit low. I mean, especially for somebody who has been known to be the one who wrote the story for a little movie called Shawshank Redemption and The Shining. To be fair, The Shining is more of a horror movie than Shawshank Redemption is, but still. You would, if you don't know Stephen King's movies very well, and you're not, I guess, versed in the Stephen King universe, I guess you could say, most of his adaptations are typically not that great. So this is relatively mediocre, both in terms of how the rest of his movies are scored and just kind of how the scoring goes on IMDb in general.
Yeah, exactly. And you brought up Shawshank Redemption, and it's interesting because one of the main players in the sequel is also a prominent person in the Shawshank Redemption. Do you remember the tall and kind of burly prison guard with the deep voice in Shawshank Redemption? He's kind of like the head prison guard.
Yeah.
He's done a lot of different voice acting in other parts over the years. He was in Pet Sematary too, so I'm like, hey, so he's been in 2 Stephen King movies.
Interesting. Yeah. All right.
Now, critics gave Pet Sematary a 50%. So that means 50% liked it and 50% didn't like it. So I guess you could say it was a polarizing movie.
Yeah. That would be considered rotten, I suppose, if it's at 50%.
Yes, it was considered rotten, which is kind of confusing because 50% seems kind of right down 50% is right down the line. So just because 50% didn't like it, that means another 50% did like it. So I wouldn't necessarily consider it rotten, even though Rotten Tomatoes does.
Yeah. I mean, it would be considered an F. So there is that.
It would be considered an F, but all of these grading scores are all different, so they don't really work to translate them if you try. So a little history here for you that I think you might find interesting. The rights were originally sold to George A. Romero.
Oh, most notably known for his Night of the Living Dead movie.
That's true.
And some sequels.
He basically invented what we know today as the modern zombie franchise with, Alan said, Night of the Living Dead. So George A. Romero was going to make this movie, and I would have loved to see a George A. Romero Pet Sematary film.
That would have been so interesting because being, I guess you could say, I guess a fitting title for him would be the master of zombie movies. Knowing that and knowing the subject matter this movie's going to go into, I think that would have been a very interesting mesh of style between Stephen King and a very renowned horror director at this point.
If I'm not mistaken, they have worked together on something before. Okay. Don't quote me, but I feel like I've looked into that. I've heard that before. So, listeners, if you know what I'm talking about, if you know, go ahead and comment below, because I'd be interested to know. Now, the rights were sold in 1984, which was right after the book released in 83, and that's something common to Stephen King. As soon as his book hits store shelves, or usually now more so than back then, the movie rights will be already like optioned into the release. Everything he has written, for the most part, has been adapted to screen, or they're in the process. There's somebody owns the rights. So his books are a TV goldmine. But Romero had to pull out because he was involved with a project called Monkey Shines. And for a few years, the film industry was basically all kinged out. They said, we've had enough of your adaptions. We are just going to shelve the rights to this right now. But a little thing happened in 1988. The Writers Guild of America went on strike, and that caused Paramount to reconsider making this film because they didn't really have many productions in the works. So they pulled this one off the shelf. And King was involved with the creation of this film, which always makes me feel better when I'm watching an adaptation, is if the author has some involvement with it.
Right. And I mean, it can go one of two different ways, because writing a book and writing a screenplay are two different things, because there's a little thing called a visual medium that is what film is, which when you write a novel, you don't have that luxury. You have to explain how things look. So there sometimes, actually this happens, but I guess quite often, where the writer will come in to oversee the project. And then once again, it can go one way or the other, where it's not really well done as an adaptation, or it's fine. I think one of the other ones that I can remember off the top of my head is Hunger Games. I know that the author came in, at least for the first movie, and got to oversee the project, how it was completed. I don't know how much input he had, but I know he was there. So, yeah, it could go one of two ways. So, there you go.
Yeah, that is true, because, like Alan said, it is a really different process with writing both mediums. And the only way that it does make me feel better is not necessarily that I'm guaranteed the work is going to be good, but at least whatever I see on screen is sanctioned by the author. So whatever changes occur, or whatever additions are added, then I know the author is okay with that because he wrote that in. For the most part, now there is a change in here that I'm not really sure that King had any say in. I think the studio kind of came in and changed it. I guess I can't talk to you about that just yet because that is a huge spoiler. So we're going to have to talk about that after the spoilers. But nevertheless, King was involved, and he did want it shot in Maine. He was insistent upon that. And it was shot in rural Maine, which Maine looks very beautiful. I'd love to visit there someday. I've never been.
Yeah, that's way north too. That's gotta be cold.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, so, yeah, I guess we'll talk about how... That is one thing, I guess, that is usually nice when a writer of the story is on set, is, you do get either an accurate portrayal of the book that was written, and or you get, I guess, the author's okay to make the changes that are necessary for the film to work. So either way, usually, like I said, and in theory, the movie when that's put on the screen that has the author on set is, you would assume, to be the thing that is okay with the author. Therefore, it is okay for the big screen.
And other people did consider this to be a good adaptation, such as IFC, which is I believe, the International Film Channel. Something like that.
I think you're
right. And Rolling Stone they have ranked it as the 16th best Stephen King adaptation. So, I mean, take that as you will. There's been like, I don't know, well over 100 adaptations, it seems like. But
yeah, especially around this time when this movie came out, there were a lot of King adaptations that were on the big screen.
Yeah, but I mean, it's in the top 20, so it's in the top 25%. So I think that's good. I think. Anyways, so I did want to mention something just so listeners who have seen the movie going in, they can keep this in mind. Or if you are about to watch the movie, then you'll know what I'm talking about. The character of Zelda is actually not played by a woman.
Really?
Yes. Zelda is played by Andrew Hubacek. And they decided to go with, and they did audition women, but they thought going with a man ultimately to play a woman would make it more of an unsettling choice.
All right, I can see why they would make that choice then.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I didn't actually put much thought into it that it would have been not a woman being played for this role.
I didn't think anything of it either the first time I saw it, except something seemed a little off, because I'm like, this looks a little weird. But then on the second time, with that knowledge in mind, I thought, okay, I can see it, and this makes sense. It was a really interesting choice. It was a good choice.
Yeah, okay.
Well, listeners, we are about to jump into the plot of the film, which means we will be spoiling it. So if you have not seen Pet Sematary just yet, and you don't want the movie spoiled for you, go ahead and click pause right now. Go watch the movie, come back and click play, and we'll be ready to talk about all the wonderful spoilery details of Pet Sematary. The Creed family is your typical nuclear family. Husband, wife, one boy, one girl. They move to scenic rural Maine for Patriarch Lewis's, played by Dale Midkiff, his new job as the doctor of a university. They have a next-door neighbor who has lived in that same house his whole life, Judd Crandall, played by Fred Gwynne. The two are separated by a dangerously active roadway, which sees frequent usage by Orinco semi-trucks. In the Creed's backyard, daughter Ellen, played by Blaze Birtle, finds a path leading into the forest. Judd takes the family up there to show them the Pet Sematary, a place where the young residents of the town bury their pets. The cemetery is enclosed by a large, seemingly unclimbable deadfall. Despite being a seemingly ordinary, quaint graveyard, Lewis's wife, Rachel, played by Denise Crosby, is upset by Judd's reasoning kids should learn about death. The next day, Lewis's first day on the job, he experiences a tragic death firsthand. A student, Victor Pascal, played by Brad Greenquist, is hit so badly by a car that he dies from the trauma, but not before eerily telling Lewis the soil of a man's heart is stonier and he tends what he can, and he bodily leaves this earth by promising he'll see Lewis that night. He does make good on that promise and awakens Lewis, who believes he's only dreaming. Pascal takes him to the Pet Sematary, where he warns Lewis, do not cross the barrier, referring to the deadfall. Thanksgiving rolls around with no real excitement for Lewis. Rachel wishes to visit her parents, but Lewis alludes to his rocky relationship with them. On Thanksgiving Day, while Rachel, Ellen, and Gage, played by Miko Hughes, are in Chicago, Lewis receives a phone call from Judd Crandall, bearing the bad news that Ellen's cat, Church, is dead on his lawn. Worried Ellen isn't yet ready to face death, Judd decides to take Lewis on a little trip beyond the Pet Sematary, past the deadfall. They reach the Micmac Indian burial ground. Not understanding why, Lewis buries Church anyway. To his surprise, Church comes back to life, but changed. Meanwhile, the Creed's housekeeper, Missy Dandridge, played by Susan Blomert, abruptly commits suicide because she can no longer stand her stomach pains. This event causes Ellen to question Lewis about the afterlife, to which he really has no solid beliefs, but we do learn why death makes Rachel cry. See, when she was a young girl, she had a sister named Zelda who suffered from spinal meningitis. One night when her parents were out, Rachel was feeding Zelda when Zelda began to choke and ultimately suffocated to death. Ever since, Rachel has not only had a fear of death, but a fear her sister may come back for revenge. After winter passes, the family enjoys the outdoors. They have a picnic, and Gage and Lewis fly a kite together. While Ellen is asking for her turn to fly the kite, Lewis takes his eyes off of Gage, who tragically wanders into the road and is instantly killed. Racked with grief, the family bury Gage, but not before a fist fight between Lewis and Rachel's dad occurs. In the hopes of patching things up, Lewis suggests Rachel and Ellen visit them in Chicago, and he'll be along eventually. Except Lewis has no intention of going. Instead, he plans to dig up Gage's corpse and transplant it in the Micmac burial ground. Meanwhile, in Chicago, Ellen is having dreams of terrible things happening to Daddy. She claims Pascal is warning her. In fact, Pascal's spirit is aiding the family as their disfigured guardian angel. Worried Ellen may be right, Rachel, with the help of Pascal, flies back to Maine, but not before being warned in a demonic vision Zelda and Gage are out to get her. Before she can reach her home, she hears the voice of her deceased sister calling from Judd's house. Upon entering the house, she sees her decrepit sister and hears the laugh of her son. As she embraces the boy, he drives his father's medical scalpel into his mother, thereby murdering her. The following morning, Lewis gets a phone call from Judd's house. Except it's not Judd. It's Gage, who professes morbid events of how he murdered his mother and Judd Crandall. Resigning himself to the fate his wife and best friend are dead, Lewis fills a few syringes full of death-inducing medicine. First he kills Church, then he finds Judd slashed up. And then worst of all, he finds Rachel hanging, and fights a horrific Gage whom he eventually stabs with a syringe. He burns down the house and all in it, save for Rachel, who he believes may be able to come back normal if he doesn't wait too long. Ignoring the final warning from Victor Pascal, Rachel does come back, and the two sickeningly embrace as she lifts a knife to murder Lewis, which prompts him to scream as credits roll.
Yeah, quite the interesting movie we have here. Definitely from the 80s. I'm pretty sure it'd be hard to think of any other time period that this would have been released in my mind.
Yes, you can definitely tell it's from the 80s. I would say always the giveaway, it's from the 80s, is not necessarily the clothes they wear, because these people's clothes really aren't too out of... people wear these clothes now today also. I would say it's kind of the film that it's shot on. Every decade has a certain type of film that kind of categorizes it to that specific decade. So you can tell it's done in the 80s, and also there are many horror films that just kind of have the same feeling to the story structure and visual effects. So yeah, you're right. It looks a lot like the 80s. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing though, because I do like some of those 80s horror movies.
Yeah. It is also interesting too, the house they come up to. They all get out of the car and the mom's like, oh, it's gorgeous. And I mean, by today's standards, it's quite an ugly house because it's got like this really like blood red roof and tan siding, and like underneath the deck, on like the ceiling of the deck, it's like green. It's super weird colors. I mean, for the time that we're in now, but back then it was a bit more normal, I suppose.
Yeah, thankfully it wasn't as bad as some of those 80s houses that, or interiors, or even things from like the 60s and 70s were just awful with their shag carpets and just truly nasty oranges and stuff. So the house is pretty big and nice. It's much bigger and structurally nicer than at least what the book alludes to, or maybe my imagination's just not that good. But it's as far as like the build is, it's a pretty nice house out there. Yeah.
So right off the bat, no more than just a couple minutes in, I already got this sense that, okay, so the cat and Gage are going to die here. Because there's this really short scene where he, I have it here in my notes, he tries to take the cat and almost walks on the road, but Mr. Crandall ends up saving him. like shuffling him off the road. So immediately I'm just like, okay, so Gage and the cat are going to die at some point in this movie. The question is when. So I kind of got the idea that first it's going to be the cat, then it's going to be Gage, and then maybe we'll learn the lesson at the end that you probably shouldn't, bring humans back from the dead.
Well, you nailed it. Yeah, this film, I think this is kind of sad to say, but that's one of the film's probably better moments of foreshadowing that's trying not to be as obvious. This film does like to telegraph to you what is going to happen next, what's going to come back to haunt you. It's always extremely obvious, and I will attribute that to King kind of thinking, how do I bring a book to life? Well, I guess what I need to do is just kind of tell the audience instead of really show them. Right.
Yeah, you basically could almost straight up tell the audience that the kid almost got ran over by a semi, and it could have killed him and the cat. And it would have been almost the exact same thing, at least with this small scene right here.
Yeah, I will say, aside from that, there is a pretty good opening here. At least they're showcasing the Pet Sematary in such a way that I think is creepy. We've got some Tim Burton-esque 80s music going on. I will say it's a nice atmosphere that does get me into the mood of what's to come, although I will say the beginning lends itself to a much more horrific film, or at least more of a horror film than what I think we actually get.
Yeah, and I mean, that really could just be more of a product of the times as well, because for the time, I'm sure this is a rather heavy movie to be watching, but now it's, I suppose, not as bad.
Now, did you recognize who Judd Crandall is? He's played by a famous actor, TV actor mostly.
I knew that he looked familiar, but I couldn't put my finger on what else I knew him from.
He plays Herman Munster in the old TV show The Munsters.
Well, that would be why I recognized him then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, without all of his makeup, he looks a little different, but he is still kind of has that tall, gaunt face. So I thought that was kind of cool to see him in there. And the studio was actually a little worried about choosing him because Herman Munster is a comedic character, and this character is more of a dramatic role. But I think he does a great job in this film. One of the better jobs of the rest of the cast.
Yeah, I would say he probably, in my mind, does the best job here than anybody else. I guess that makes a little bit of sense. I could see the voice now, because it was always the voice that kept bringing me back to, okay, who is that voice? I know that voice from somewhere. It has been a while since I've seen The Munsters, but yeah, okay, so that makes a bit more sense to me. So, yeah, I would say he probably is the best actor here, and the acting is, aside from him, it's fine in some scenes. I think the dad, and sometimes he's fine, and sometimes he's not all that great. The wife is the same way. The kid is fine. I mean, the baby, Gage, you can't really get too much out of him already. But yeah, the acting for the most part here it's fine, but it does have some of that 80s schlock thrown into it, which is, like I said, kind of mentioned earlier, it's a product of the times. It's not really avoidable. So
I'll go ahead and say it. Dale Midkiff, who plays Lewis, is probably the worst actor here, which is
I would probably agree with that.
And that's unfortunate because the film is, he kind of holds up certain tenets of the film because he is our lead for the most part. And if the lead isn't interesting, then I'm going to be less interested, and I'm not going to believe situations in the film as much. And unfortunately, Dale Midkiff doesn't really know how to be that expressive. When he does try to be expressive, it comes across as corny or just ridiculous, honestly, especially there towards the end. But for the first half of the movie, he's just so boring. He's just so monotone with his voice and his face, and I was disappointed with his performance.
Yep, and to make things even weirder, we do get we are told that he's a doctor and that they moved here because he's going to be working at the college nearby, but that only really happens in like one scene where we actually see him do doctory things, and aside from that, it's basically never mentioned again for the whole movie.
Yeah, that is one of the points that they bring up and drop really quickly, and that is threaded throughout the book much better. And I guess that brings me up to probably one of my first issues with this movie is, although the initial sequences, probably for at least for the majority of the movie, they are really adapted from the book well. At least as far in, yeah, this is the scene from the book and this is the story in a truncated format. But ultimately, we get to these places and then we just breeze past them, like you said, with him being a doctor, so quickly that they don't necessarily need to be this quick. They're not threaded throughout the story in an organic way. Everything feels kind of blocky with how sequences are presented to us. So I was disappointed about that. Apparently, this movie was initially much longer. Okay. The studio...
I wonder what it would have been like with a longer cut.
I think it would have been better, because the studio said, this movie is too long. Nobody's going to want to sit through this. Cut it down. This movie isn't even 2 hours, but the book is well over 500 pages. So the movie should have been at least 2 hours.
Yeah, that's a lot of condensing you have to do to get a book of 500 pages to the big screen. I mean, I know that Shawshank Redemption is like 2.5 hours or getting close to that, and it's a short story. Yeah. It's not a full-length book. Yeah. So, I mean, you're always going to do some kind of condensing with a book especially of Stephen King's length, and even ideas like Harry Potter as well. I know have some serious condensing in them. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it is kind of sad because this doctor thing happens in this one scene, and then only really, I guess, kind of is a connection to later on when Gage grabs the scalpel and goes nuts with it, which only makes sense because he's a doctor. Aside from that, and maybe the Missy's saying, hey, I have stomach pains, maybe you can look at them, and then decides not to at the end. That's basically the only, I guess, way of us knowing that he's a doctor. If they had cut out that doctor scene, it's very hard. It'd be very hard for us to know that he was actually a doctor.
A choice I was really surprised that they made is they made Judd Crandall single, because in the book he has a wife named Norma, and Norma does have like heart issues. She's fairly old, and there is a point in the book where Norma has a heart attack, and that's where Lewis's doctor skills really come into play for the story, is with helping save Norma's life. And then there's like a bit more about that later on. So it does use his doctor skills and cut back and forth to that. And the book also talks a bit more about Lewis's beliefs in life and death and practicality from his doctoral side, but then kind of believing in the supernatural afterlife, and how can a doctor believe that somebody can come back to life? So he's constantly trying to rationalize everything that's going on. So I was disappointed to see that could have made him a stronger character in this book if they would have retained that.
Yeah, I'm totally with you, because it is interesting that he is a doctor and he is the driving force to be the one who wants to bring things back to life 2 times, actually 3 times in this movie. So, I mean, the connection is there, but the problem is the movie does not even touch that. It doesn't really dive very deep into why he thinks the way that he does, why he's kind of wondering how can he bring things back? How can this be a thing? What would happen if I did this? We don't really dive too deep with that at all, aside from him saying, I have the drive and I have a love for my son and my wife, so therefore I'm going to do it. And it's very surface level. I'm wondering, and from what I understand, it sounds like the book goes much deeper with that.
Yes, it does. And another thing that, and of course with the book you do have more time to build things up and explain them, right, because 2/3 of the book is mostly just about the family's relationships and their dynamics. So you really do care about them. And there are very, very tiny hints of what might go on. And if I hadn't seen the movie or knew anything about it, Gage's death would have hit me even harder than it did. And reading the book, it does hit you extremely hard. Because the way it's told after the point, and then Lewis kind of has these Jacob's Ladder type flashbacks of when his son died. So that whole scene was incredibly heavy, and it hit you really well. But like I said, Gage's death doesn't come till well past page 300. And at that point, you know, you're past midway, and there's not a whole lot left to do. But what does happen happens in a timely manner, and it all does take its time to breathe, but it still is heavy, whereas this film doesn't necessarily do that. But yeah, I did want to bring up one more complaint here in the beginning, and that is when they get to the Pet Sematary. I don't know if this is an editing issue where they did need to kind of space scenes out, like more so transitional scenes, instead of just, what's the Pet Sematary? Oh, I'll take you up there sometime. Cut to him taking them up there. I did understand that there was a tiny transitional scene where she's like, hey, come on, let's go. And then you see them walk for like 2 seconds. But in the book, it was a much bigger deal where there was kind of these like scary, ominous little, like, oh, you know, up there, yeah, that's a place we'll talk about sometime. And then when they actually go up there, it's kind of this mysterious hike that's strenuous. And when they get up there, I was a little disappointed that we just get there. And I just feel that kind of just kills any vibes we're getting, or halts them before they can even begin of mystery.
Yeah, I'm with you, because they kind of introduced the Pet Sematary, and before we even have, I guess, a chance to imagine what is this Pet Sematary, we're there. This also kind of brings up an interesting question for me, because early on, I think it actually is one of Judd's like first lines. He says that a lot of pets die here, and that's where the Pet Sematary came from. Did nobody think about putting up a fence in this house or either house? Because those trucks, the semis that fly through that road, they go pretty fast. Like, to a point where I would assume that somebody should probably start enforcing some kind of better speed limit around that area. But did nobody think about putting up a fence, especially after seeing the Pet Sematary? Because I feel like that would solve almost all the problems here.
Yeah, that'd be a good idea. Definitely is one of the things that I thought about as well. And also, at least the way the book is told, I was also thinking, why didn't they build this house farther back from the road? Because it's fairly close to the road, and maybe the road wasn't as active when they built the house. I don't know if I really buy that either, though. But it does seem like the perfect storm that they built a house next to the busiest road in America. And
right.
It does aggravate me how poorly they watch their children. And it's like,
yeah. Really?
I mean, this road's really busy. Like, you're just being the most neglectful parent ever, or what's going on here?
Right. Yeah. It just, I mean, I can probably get behind the fact that perhaps the road was kind of crafted after the fact, and it kind of ended up becoming a quick route, the most busiest route, just by happenstance. I'll get behind that. I just can't believe that nobody would decide, especially after they've buried who knows how many pets in the Pet Sematary because they keep getting run over, that no one would just think that, oh, maybe we should go to a fence, because I feel like that would just solve all the issues here.
Not to mention, you'd have to like gun it out of your driveway just so you would like get up to speed in traffic like really quickly and not get rear-ended.
Yeah. That's why I'm wondering, maybe we should do some enforcing of speed limits or harsher speed limits, because you can't hardly back out of your driveway now. To be fair, the line is pretty big, so perhaps you have time to turn around, but still, who's going to do that?
One of the first departures from the book, one of the first editions, is the prominence of the character Missy Dandridge.
Yeah, I was wondering about her a lot.
She was referenced so little in the book that I would often forget. I'm like, now where did she just come from? And I'm like, oh, I guess she watches their kids sometimes. From what I understand, she is one of the neighbors and they're like fairly far spaced out, but she just kind of babysits the kids from time to time when the parents need someone to watch them. But if my memory is correct, she's married in the book, and she is just kind of this sweet older lady that really doesn't have much part to play. But for the movie, King made her their prominent housekeeper who has these horrible stomach pains that she doesn't want anybody to look at. She's just this pessimist but she's kind of funny, honestly, while going through this. But then all of a sudden she just writes the suicide note and hangs herself in the basement. And I'm like, what?
Yeah. And she's like, I think in 3 scenes, maybe?
Mm-hmm.
I want to say she's only in 3 scenes. At least I remember her in 3 scenes. But yeah, she plays such a non-prominent role that when she does die, it's like, what? And I think the movie kind of explains that when you give something to the burial ground for it to be resurrected, it takes something away. But I guess I'm missing the connection there as to why Missy would be the one to go. If that's the case, it just seems like an odd choice aside from just trying to build tension in just a very poor way.
From what I gathered, the reason that they wrote Missy up and had her die is just because Norma Judd isn't in it and she died, which prompts Ellie to ask all these questions about the afterlife and bring up those subjects. Since Norma isn't in it, which I can't even understand why, for some reason they chose to have Missy play that role, but instead of just make it a natural death, they made it a suicide. So that's my only guess, is because they didn't have Norma to die from the book, so they'll have Missy die in the movie. It's odd.
I feel like having Norma in the movie replacing Missy would have been a much better way of going about talking about this issue of death, because you have even older couple across the street that all the kids are moved out of the house, if they even had kids. I can't remember if they did. And they're getting towards that age where death is becoming a thing that could easily happen to them because they are getting that old. And then you have this very young couple across the street with kids and so full of life and things like that. And you have this dichotomy between these two families right across the road from this really busy road. I feel like that would have been a much better way of portraying life and death in a movie like this, in my own personal opinion.
Oh yeah, it definitely would have been better, because Judd and Norma Crandall very much become the grandparent figures to the kids. And also, we find out Lewis never had a dad. His dad died when he was a small child. So Judd becomes his father figure and also his best friend. I understand that they're friends in this, but I never really get any close relationship between the two of them.
Yeah, I got a hint of a fatherly role from Judd, but it really wasn't developed very well, if that was what they were going for.
Now, what do you think of Rachel and Lewis's on-screen relationship?
It's an interesting one, because most of the time Rachel is either yelling at her kids or saying that's not the way I want them to be parented when she talked about like them teaching about death, or she's asleep. So there's really not much to her character aside from the climax, I guess. Yeah,
in the initial scenes, I feel like they have decent on-screen chemistry. I think it's believable, their relationship. And she is a very conflicted character in the book because of her past and how she deals with death. And it's much more meaningful dealing with Norma's death, and Rachel won't go to the funeral, but with Missy's death, and especially that occurring, doesn't that occur within like the first act, maybe the beginning of the second act?
What does?
Missy's death.
Yeah, I think it's into the second act, but it is pretty early on.
Yeah, so it's too early for us to really have any grasp of the meaning behind any of this, I would say.
Yeah. I mean, I know it happens pretty soon after Church is brought back, if I'm not mistaken. But Rachel's character, I think there's a lot there that the movie just, for one reason or another, doesn't explore. Because we do kind of get a reason why she doesn't want her kids to have anything to be taught about them towards death. But I don't think it's a very good reason, and it comes off as more of, we have some more pressing psychological issues with the wife than what the movie's kind of wanting to get into here. I feel like her reasonings for not wanting to teach the children about death are rather weak. They may have been better in the book, but from the way that the movie portrays it, it just feels more like it's a psychological issue with the wife than it is a good reason as to why she wouldn't want her kids to know about it at all. And that is one of the things Lewis is confused over,
to him, her just sheer willingness to not even want to talk about death or face it is just incomprehensible. And he says, like, as a doctor, death is just a natural part of, the sequence of life. It's something we all have to go through, and it's really not something that needs to bring distraught and major arguments over. Now, in the movie, Rachel crying while Lewis talks about this, or being really concerned, or just getting up in arms, I think they do a good job of kind of threading that throughout the plot to make us interested in why she feels this way. And then in the book and movie, when you finally do hear about her sister Zelda, it is a horrific thing that we do learn about. And that was the one scene that I was curious to see what you would think of it, because regardless what you think of the movie or how much you remember of it, the character of Zelda, I think, is unforgettable because she is so grotesque and terrifying, and just that whole flashback, it just gives you the creeps. It's just, ugh.
Yeah, the character of Zelda is definitely one of the more creepier parts of this. It is interesting too, this is kind of getting a bit off track, but it is interesting too that she's just now explaining to her husband that this is the reason why I don't want to talk about death, but whatever. Yeah, this scene, especially with Zelda, makes me wonder if a longer movie would have made this a lot more fleshed out. Not just this scene, but kind of just the whole movie in general, because for the most part, I feel like we're just living mostly on the surface level of this idea of bringing life back from death, and we don't really go too deep into it, aside from the doctor being the one who's, I'm curious about this, and that's about as far as I go. And especially here with Zelda, there's something here, and it's interesting, but they don't dive too deep with it. Aside from this one scene, and then some apparitions later on with the wife, that's about all that we get with her past. And I think that this is a very interesting past, especially when they say that though they didn't, I think the line is something along the lines of, they didn't let Zelda die because they wanted her to stop suffering. They themselves wanted to stop suffering. So I guess they didn't really care too much that when she died or whatever. It's an interesting line that really does kind of explain the parents that she has, but once again, it doesn't probe too deep with this idea.
No, it doesn't probe too deep with it, and the reason what the book is trying to do is connect Zelda and Gage, and that's strongly not even referenced, it's just strongly shown here in the movie. Basically, Rachel's fear of death is she was home alone, and I was a little disappointed because I did want them to spend more time on the Zelda flashback, and I remembered it being much creepier than it actually was. Don't get me wrong, it still is creepy, but I just had some much darker memories of it. And that is one thing that I'm most looking forward to with the new movie, is how will they handle Zelda. And I really hope it's a little bit more grotesque and terrifying, because especially judging from her memories, it should be more nightmarish how we remember things. But they're trying to show that she was this little girl, her parents left her alone. Zelda essentially became this fairly evil entity that would just do nasty things, like just soil her bed on purpose just to spite them. And then she did watch her sister suffocate, and it does, like, the mental trauma is a bit more explored in the book, and then it's supposed to tie back to how she lost her son. She lost her sister, and then she lost her son in a horrific way, and then that comes back. It's not too much of an intricate part of the book, nor too much of a main focus, but nevertheless, I think the Zelda sequence and how Zelda kind of reoccurs is an unexpected addition that I think is nice. It did not have to be in this at all. Like, this just could have been a story without it. But but them bringing in Zelda, I think, it kind of raises the level just a bit.
Yeah, I would have liked for them to really explore that connection between Zelda and Gage towards the end a bit more, because in the movie they don't really do that. There's something there, but it's not that much. They really don't do much to explore that. That seems to be the whole thing about my biggest issue, just kind of with the movie all the way around, is there are things here, but they don't really explore them very well at all.
Now, we should mention the character of Victor Pascal, because he is a major player in this movie, more so than in the book. And I do get frustrated with this character in the third act. But he's fine here in the first act. He kind of gives us this ominous warning. It's not as ominous as I would have liked because we get those cheesy 80s glow effects through the trees.
Yeah. There are moments where the effects work, and then there are moments when they absolutely don't work at all. This is one of those moments where you can tell it's fake.
One of the more odd choices this movie makes is its timing of when they shoot certain scenes. I'm wondering if just to make things easier, they opted to just shoot most everything in the daylight, except towards the end, which even still, a lot of it's in the daylight. In the book, a lot of this stuff is done at twilight, and it kind of gives you this sense of, when it comes to the Pet Sematary and the Micmac burial ground, there's kind of like this weird timelessness, like you're entering the Twilight Zone, and there's just this otherworldly feeling going on. But I was so disappointed when Church dies, and then they're climbing the deadfall. This was all done at twilight, when it's dusk, but this is during the day in the movie.
Right, yeah, they must be quite a road that they had to take, because they pick up the cat, stuff him in a bag, and then when they leave, the sun is still out. But by the time that they get to the burial ground, the sun is down. And it's definitely like in the middle of the night. It must have taken them a long time to get there. It seems like almost like an all-day thing where they get there and they have to walk all the way back, and they're going to get back maybe early in the morning. Right,
and I mean that is close to the book, but it's not, because, like I said, when they leave, it's sunset, and when they get back, they're like, gosh, it must be like 3 a.m, and come to find out only just a few hours have passed.
Right.
Not long at all, 2 hours maybe at the most, which they're really surprised about. So I was a little disappointed. Once again, they just crossed the deadfall, and they hear this loud noise in the trees, which is supposed to be the Wendigo monster. Have you heard of that?
Can't say that I have.
I think it's like some Native American folk legend of this Wendigo monster. It's brought up here a little bit, but Judd just explains it's just like noise is drifting up. It comes back more so in the end of the book, and it's really frightening scene where Lewis actually walks through the footprint of it, and it's just this giant monstrosity that he can kind of feel its presence in the mist around him. And then also when they climb, they also have to climb really high up to the Wendigo burial ground. And it's just a lot different. I feel like they kind of cheapened it here for the movie, so I was disappointed.
Yeah, I did wonder where that giant roar that came when they first first climbing up to the burial ground, where that came from and why it was never referenced ever again. But yeah, okay, going back to Pascal though, I find his character to be mostly just a plot device for this entire movie. Especially in the third act, he kind of just pops up here and there and then becomes, for whatever reason, a driving force to lead the wife back home and help her out, kind of. His character feels almost worthless to me because of how they portray him in this movie. He's meant to be a guardian angel, like you said, but the way they go about that just seems rather poor than actually crafting a character that I guess would mean a lot more had they given him something more to do, I suppose.
Oh yeah, he's definitely worthless in this movie, and once again, a problem that we encounter frequently is thinking the audience needs someone to hold their hand through this movie.
Yeah.
And that role is filled by Victor Pascal, but I think he's referenced in the second act as maybe Ellie, which bugs me because her name is Ellen, but in the book they call her Ellie because she's a little girl. It just sounds better to call a little girl Ellie, I think. They just call her Ellen throughout this movie, and I'm like, why? Why did you do that? Anyways, nitpick, whatever. But yeah, then I was really shocked to see he plays such a prominent role in the third act as it just becomes a team up of Rachel. Rachel never has any of this help in it, in the book. Ellie does have these bad dreams, which leads me to suppose Ellie might have the shining, which is not something uncommon for kids to have outside of the book, The Shining. So I'm assuming Ellie has The Shining and she has these premonitions of what's going on. But then we need Victor Pascal almost for comic relief, it feels like.
Yeah, there are moments where it almost feels like it's comic relief. Like it comes dangerously close in a few scenes, and some of them are unintentional too.
Oh, I know. And in the 80s, they really struggled to keep a consistent tone with certain things. Things would just get cheesy. Yeah.
And I mean, the character of Ellie is also strange to me because, like you mentioned just a second ago, she has like these visions of what's going to happen. Like it's almost like a That's So Raven way of going about this kind of a thing.
Yeah,
it's weird. I don't really see why it's here because she warns multiple times as to what's going to happen, and nobody really cares. I guess until it's too late. But even then, they don't really. The movie doesn't really show that, oh crap, she was right the whole time. It just seems like it was thrown in because it's in the book, therefore we have to have it in the movie, I guess. But even then, there are a lot of things here that seem like they're in the book, but totally not in the movie, and that would have made the movie a lot better. Her character just seems really odd when it comes to this aspect of her, this character trait, I guess, with these psychic visions of the future.
Yeah, another thing is the whole reason of bringing Church back was to spare. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. You're frozen, so I just want to make sure you could hear me. Another reason for kind of Ellie's premonitions and bringing Church back is for her to realize that something is off, but then also for her to kind of be comfortable with mortality. And we really don't get that here in the movie, because she was so close with her cat, and I guess I'm disappointed with that, is they went through all the trouble of bringing her cat back to life, and she's like, give Church a kiss for me, but then she just says, hey, Church smells bad, go outside, and then we never see that relationship again, and that's kind of prominent. That should have been carried through better.
Yeah, once they bring Church back from the dead, the cat kind of goes into the background, which is weird for a movie that's called Pet Sematary. So,
I did think it was funny when he threw that dead rat in the tub, which, can cats throw things?
I don't know. I have seen my cat carry a dead bird into the house.
Oh, that's fun.
So, which was it was still alive. So, yeah, cats do bring things into the house. I haven't seen my cat bring a dead rat, but I have also seen my cat take mittens and toss them up in the air and then chase them, which is weird for a cat to do. But yeah, they do toss things, but I don't know if a rat is light enough for them to do that. Maybe it's because it was dead and now it's alive. That seems to be a running trope with things that come back alive. They have super strength now for some reason.
Yeah, I did think it was funny when he throws the rat in the tub. It was also, the rat looked really fake, but it was just gross. And he accidentally steps on it. I'm like, you're grossing me out here.
Yeah, kind of gross.
I did want to mention, guys, Stephen King cameo in this movie, kind of like Alfred Hitchcock would do with his movies. Stephen King is the minister at Missy Dandridge's funeral, where we get a really prominent shot of him just, saying the eulogy, may the Lord's face shine upon you. And I'm like, hey, that's Stephen King. That's cool.
Yeah. I mean, I missed it because I don't really know Stephen King's face all that well.
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps on a rewatching, I would have noticed it. But yeah.
Now, when Ellie does start to ask about heaven and hell, I concluded this from the book, and I also did feel the movie draws this point as well, is the movie is not meant to give us a definitive doctrinal worldview about heaven and hell, but rather the narrative is a cautionary tale against playing God. So I would say that's the prominent worldview.
Yeah, this is very much, it's kind of one of those things where maybe you shouldn't bring things back from the dead, leave them, let them stay dead because they've kind of run their course. I can see where it's going off of that kind of an angle and not necessarily saying that, if you bring things back from the dead, if you try to play God, then it's a bad thing. It's more to do with that you just shouldn't in general, because as obvious in this movie, they come back and they're not so great anymore, which I mean, I think it's an interesting thing that they have a doctor as the guy who's like the driving force to kind of walk through this and be like, why is this a thing? Why should we do this? I want to do this. And then I guess he kind of learns his lesson at the end, but then kind of doesn't. It's weird, but yeah. I do like that aspect that they take a doctor. Once again, though, they don't really drive too deep with it.
And it is an interesting concept to explore, I would say, is, you know, out of the ground, God made man, according to the book of Genesis. And then it's like, what if man could put something in the ground and have it come back as well? But they're using this Micmac burial ground, which were kind of the evil Indians they talk about in the book. They were opposed to the good Indians, and they kind of took over, and they just kind of cursed the ground and cursed the land. And so people have been kind of addicted to this thought and power, thinking, you know, they're clinging on to mortality. They're clinging on to life instead of just accepting the death. And they always think each time they do it or introduce it to somebody else, they're like sparing them from some kind of tragedy. But then they ultimately realize that death comes to us all, and it shouldn't be this horrible thing that we should cling to life. So I really do like that exploration of death and resurrection, and is this a good thing or a bad thing for these people to try and enact? And ultimately, the book lands on playing God comes with serious consequences, usually dire ones, and it'll nevertheless be an addictive thing because you can think that you can always fix the situation. And just clinging to life is not necessarily always a good thing.
Right. Yeah, I do like that. It also kind of goes into this idea that even death can be sometimes, I guess, the best answer to things, because not necessarily saying that, because they kind of reference this, but only really in one line, and that's that Zelda was the one who was suffering, and then when Zelda did die, it was more like they did it for themselves, the parents and the daughter, than they did it for Zelda, who was in pain. But it more to the idea that, especially when it comes to like Gage, who is, even though he's a young kid and has a lot of life left in him, it's still not a good idea to try and bring him back. I mean, the movie does take more of a cinematic role where the kid becomes more of a killer, but the idea is still there that, you know, it's going to come with some serious consequences if you try to do something like this, like playing God in this kind of a role.
Unfortunately, Gage's death scene is handled really poorly.
Yeah.
I was shocked at how bad it was when Lewis slow-mo yells no, and there's like old camera flashes of Gage's baby pictures. I just couldn't believe it.
Yeah, especially the dad screaming no is already kind of cheesy enough, but them flashing the pictures of Gage is just kind of the icing on the cake. Yeah, this moment, which, and I feel like should have been much more heavy than it actually was, is handled rather poorly, to say the least.
Yeah, it is handled really poorly. I was very disappointed with it. It was a bit reminiscent of Rob Zombie's Halloween 2 when Annie dies and they play those home videos of her as a little girl. I found that to be more effective, still not the best. I remember you didn't care for that, Alan, but would you say that was a little better than this?
That's hard to say. I would probably say that one is a bit better, but only by a little bit, because at least that one had a little bit of context going into it. This one, although there's context there, the way that they handle it kind of ruins it.
Yeah, I agree. Neither of them are top-notch emotional punches, I would say.
Yeah. And I mean, this scene already kind of begins, and you just know that Gabe's gonna die here because he's flying the kite, and there's this looming sense of dread when the scene begins. I kind of knew that, okay, so this is the scene where Gabe dies. He's gonna get hit by a semi, and turns out that's what happens.
Did you find it shocking when Lewis's father-in-law starts punching him at the funeral?
Yeah, it seemed kind of unnecessary. I mean, I understand that the father-in-law does not like the dad at all. I get that part, but it just seems rather odd to put this into the movie. I mean, and maybe it is kind of a foreshadowing that he's going to put Gage into the Micmac burial ground, because he does knock over the coffin. You see the hand kind of show there for a moment. So that's what it's there for, but it just seems out of nowhere that the dad decides to just start yelling at Lewis here. It just seems like we're creating conflict just for the sake of creating conflict so we can foreshadow some things, but it doesn't do it in a very good way.
Well, it's good to get your perspective on it because I have all the context to the situation.
Right.
The movie doesn't provide any of it, mind you, but the book does, so I know why he's swinging punches at him, and it's a pretty intense scene in the book, but not having read the book, yeah, I would definitely agree that there is no context to this, save for Lewis saying, "I'll never be a part of that family." Well, that doesn't mean they start beating you up in the church on your son's funeral.
Yeah, that's totally the father-in-law's fault here.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing that Lewis did is retaliate in self-defense.
And one of the things that I think we've kind of been touching on here is they're really struggling to maintain like a coherent sense of like linear context with why these scenes like connect or giving us genuine payoffs. Once again, it's more so like, oh, that was in the book. Let's throw that in here. And it's just more so, blocks that are stacked on top of each other instead of like a line drawn.
Right.
Well, we do get a flashback to how Judd said that somebody did bury a person up there, and Judd and his friends went and lit the whole place on fire and killed him. I do take issue with this because Judd and his friends never did any such thing. They basically confronted him and said, "Hey, your son's kind of nuts and he's kind of scaring everybody, so quit it." And there's really interesting because the son comes up to them and he has like this evil, I guess almost demonic knowledge of everything they're doing like wrong in their life. So he was like saying, "Hey, you're cheating on your wife, you're, cheating on your taxes or whatever." And so he would all tell them all these, bad things in their life, these like dirty little secrets they didn't want anybody to know. And then the father eventually was like, couldn't take his son anymore. So he like shot him in the head and then shot himself and like burned their house down. I don't know why they make Judd the villain here, as he's like, "Hey, we're just going to take the law into our own hands and just burn these people up."
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, the guy needed to die because he's already dead and already causing a bunch of issues. But it's like, yeah, they're taking matters into their own hands here. And he is kind of painted as a villain because he's the one who did it. And it also becomes foreshadowing, which is going to happen much later in the movie, in the third act, of what Lewis is going to do. But yeah, it was an odd choice for one to bring this up now, because I think this should have been brought up a while ago. Because we're just introducing more information into this movie at the wrong time. But at the same time, yeah, they do play Judd as the villain for reasons that are just weird to me.
I'm also interested to know what you think of the atmosphere of the movie.
I would say the best use of it, especially with what they're going for, is probably this third act, when you do get the sense that Dad's kind of going crazy, and he's wanting to bring back not only his son, but then later his wife. I think that's probably the best moment where they actually utilize some atmosphere to its full effect. I think it could be done much better, like maybe given more context as to why he wants to bring back his wife, other than saying, "She just died a few minutes ago," or "She just died recently, so maybe she'll be fine." But aside from that, oh yeah, one other example I think that does a really good job. There was one shot when he digs his son up from his grave, and then like he's holding his son up against his chest, sitting on the side of the hole he dug, and the gravestone next to him. That's probably the best shot in the movie.
Yeah.
It's not framed very well, but it definitely conveys a lot of emotion as to what it's trying to do. It's portraying a lot of emotion in a way that feels correct, in a way that feels like, okay, this is the way you do it, rather than, every other way they just try to do that. So I think that there are aspects here at the very end, especially where the atmosphere is taken a much different route than it has before, and I think it does a much better job. Not to say that it's good, but it is much better.
Absolutely. That is, I would agree, one of the best scenes of the movie. I put, wow. It's so twisted to see a father holding his dead child while sitting in the grave hole. And I think that's something the movie does, I would like to have seen more throughout the movie, is kind of this like twisted nature, kind of this inverted aspect where this young family should be focusing on life, but it seems like the more they try to focus on life, the more death crops up and everything just becomes inverted, where church is always bringing them dead things to remind them of, well, death. And then just they have all these people, like the Norma is dying around them, and they just keep hearing increasingly haunting stories of the past, of how people have used this for purposes, but it ends up just driving them insane. And even the road is just always a constant reminder of just kind of dread. This, they're not mortal. It's always hanging over their heads. So I would agree. The third act is the most atmospheric. Otherwise, this movie does not even have much of a horror aspect to it at all, which I was disappointed about. And there's very little emotion found in this movie, save for when he does hold Gage. And then they do have to re-kill their child, I guess.
Right. Yeah, that scene when he's holding Gage, I think, is probably the most palpable scene in this whole movie. And it's kind of sad to say, because I feel like there should be more of that here. Like, maybe one of the changes they could have made is maybe have Church die while Ellie was at home, or something along those lines, so you can get some more emotion from this movie. Because for the most part, it feels somewhat emotionless, aside from a couple of scenes. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of sad because of a movie that's dealing with, life and death. And sometimes the emotions that go into that and what drives a person to pursue life. They don't really explore those deeper themes here. They kind of reference them, but then they kind of move on to something else. Once again, they're not probing very deep here.
Alan, were you clear on Rachel's motivation to get back to their house as quickly as possible here towards the end?
I was a bit confused because I know Pascal had something to do with all this. I guess to a certain extent, but then it also kind of came off as he actually doesn't have much power to do this. I was a bit confused as to what her motivation was. I was a bit confused as to what her motivation was to drive back home and check on everybody and see what's going on. It just seemed rather strange, and the apparitions from their daughter didn't really help matters either, because it didn't really aid the scene in any way either.
Yeah, I was afraid that all of this would come across as far too ambiguous as to any real character motivations here, save for Duex Victor Pascal, who, would just conveniently comes in and gives everybody dreams and stuff. So in the book, it's much more clear that Rachel is severely grieving, and Lewis has no ability whatsoever to comfort Rachel or Ellie. So Lewis wants to get them both out of the house for the purpose of bringing Gage back and then hopefully reintroducing Gage back into the home. He feels that Gage will probably be mentally retarded, but that's okay. And he thinks that getting out of the house will help Rachel, but as a doctor, he knows that that's not the best thing for her, actually, to get her out of the house. It's best to just kind of stay there, confront their problems, and, kind of grieving it over them. But instead, there's much more of a internal struggle where Lewis really debates doing this. He knows in his heart that he'll always do it, but he wants to get caught and stopped from doing this because he just knows it's not right. But then Rachel never feels easy about Lewis just staying there for a few days and then coming along with her. And then Ellie keeps bringing up these kind of weird dreams she's having about something going wrong. And then Rachel's like, I just have a bad feeling as well. And then Rachel comes to the conclusion that Lewis is going to commit suicide. She's like, that's why he wants us out of the house, is so he can just kill himself. And I think that's much more of a stronger motivation than having Pascal being just this guardian angel warning.
Yeah, that works so much better on so many levels because it is such an internal struggle from both ends. One for Lewis to try and save his kid, and one for the mom to kind of put the pieces together and think he's going to commit suicide. It makes a lot more sense to put when you put it in that perspective, but that's something that the movie once again just doesn't explore for one reason or another. He just does it because he wants to get them out of the house, really only for the reason of trying to save Gage. And then trying to reintroduce that Gage back to the family, which is, I mean, the reason is there, and you can tell that the man's kind of degraded into this state, but the way that they pull that off is not very well done.
Now, as for the final horror sequence we have here, I think that the sequence where Judd is trying to find Gage is one of the better horror sequences of the movie. I really like the POV shots. The camera work is unsettling because we're just as mystified and on edge as Judd is. And also, the set design of his home, it's just dark. The lighting is well done, but it's just kind of this decrepit old house that we've never been in before. So I would say probably this is the strongest horror element, Judd's death scene. Now, Rachel, on the other hand, I don't think works as well.
Yeah, Judd's death, it is kind of funny, though, because before all this, he knows that Lewis is going to go bring his child back, and then sits on his deck and waits, and then falls asleep. Yeah. So he does absolutely nothing to try and stop Lewis. It's kind of funny. But, yeah, this scene, I did remember seeing one snippet of this movie, and that's the scene when Gage cuts his Achilles heel. I think it was back, I forget what I was watching, but I'm guessing it was some Watch Mojo video back when I had an obsession with him. And that was the scene that one of the things that they were showing is that scene. And I was like, I remember this. But yeah, this is probably the best moment in the movie, or one of the better, it's the best moment in terms of the climax here is Judd's death scene. When they move on and Gage attacks Lewis, it doesn't look very good. And then Mom also doesn't, it doesn't really have that emotional punch that I feel like it should probably have.
No, it does not have the emotional punch it should have, which I was really hoping that it would. It is a quick scene in the book, but it's such a sad scene. And then when Lewis does wake up the next day, he doesn't get a call from Gage and gets all infuriated and runs over there and sees the house with like mold all over it.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't really understand that. What happens is it's just more so just a sense of just this total dread, or just this total like depression, I guess, where Lewis sees a strange car parked in front of Judd's house and Church is laying on top of it. Lewis just has this feeling that something's completely wrong, and he thinks that what if Rachel drove back, and just it's just like Lewis completely resigns himself that his wife is dead, Judd is dead. He has to use the syringes on Church and that other guy, and I really like that more of this Lewis just completely settles into the fallout of his actions. Whereas this, we get this over-the-top fight scene, which is not in the book at all. Lewis just takes his son out, and it's just such this serene moment of just, I guess it's just much more serene, but it's still just, I'm having trouble thinking of the proper word, but it's just somber, I guess I would say.
Yeah. Okay, so the end, you're telling me the ending is him just injecting his son with this medicine and that's it, and then him kind of like wallowing in the way in what he did and stuff like that.
Yes, but then he does burn the house down, but then he takes Rachel out there, and it's really weird because he has a friend that is not, I think they're barely referenced here in the movie. You wouldn't even know who they were if you hadn't read the book. But his friend sees Lewis climb the deadfall with Rachel's body, and then all of a sudden he crawls out to him, and Lewis turns around, and Lewis has aged by many decades, and he just looks extremely like old. Like the whole situation just took a major toll on him. And then he's just sitting at the table waiting for Rachel, and Rachel does come back, and she just puts her hands on him and says like, "Hello, darling," and then it ends.
That feels like a bit more of an emotional punch because you don't know if Rachel is going to be the same way as Gage is when she wakes up. That is interesting because, this scene when he fights Gage is really, this is one of the worst moments of special effects because you can tell it's a doll, you can tell it's a puppet, and it doesn't age well at all for this movie.
No.
But, and the scene where he does inject his son it feels like there's some emotion just missing in this scene, like there really should be because it is his son and he was the one who did this and now he has to solve it. And so that does sound like the book had much more of an emotional punch to it that the movie is sorely missing. It feels like the movie was going for a let's just scare the audience as much as we can kind of vibe. And while it may have worked back in the 80s, it is not really held up very well.
No. I mean, I did remember the creepy scene of animatronic Gage like staring down from at the attic. I mean, that's kind of like a good memory. Like if you watch it in the movie, it doesn't look good, but your memory softens it up and makes it look a lot better than it really did. And then he jumps down and he's basically just shaking around with a doll. I mean, that was one of my major problems with the Child's Play movies, the Chucky movies, is how in the world can a doll overpower a fully grown human being?
Right.
Same with a child. I understand, I guess these people come back with enhanced powers, although that's not necessarily true in the book. Nevertheless, it wouldn't be that hard to overpower Gage. Thankfully, King knew that in the book. For some reason, I'm thinking this is studio mandated. You have to have some exciting climax. Because I do know that the movie was going to end like the book, where Rachel just comes in and says, "Hello, darling." Although Rachel wouldn't have been all decrepit because she wouldn't have decayed at all with that fast of time period. And then the movie was just going to end. But the studio said, "Whoa, that's not exciting. Have a scene where they're like,
that's not scary."
Yeah, they're like, make her look gross and have him make out in a nasty way, and then she can like, maybe she'll stab him, and screams, and then cut to black. So the studio messed it up, and not to mention when he does stick his son with a needle, it's so cheesy when Gage says, "No fair," and then
no fair,
walks away, bonks his head, and then he burns him up. I'm like, why?
Yeah. I mean, I kind of like the idea that they have, I guess, that they're going for when he does kiss his wife after she's been brought back.
Gross.
It's gross, but I like the idea that they're going for. I don't think that they pull it off very well, mind you.
No, I like it too.
But, it is an interesting way of showing that he's basically become completely obsessed with this idea of life after death to a point where, I mean, it is his wife after all, so I mean, there is already the love aspect already brought into it. But I think it is interesting. But once again, there really is no emotion put into it. Maybe there's a little bit, but not very much. So it kind of plays away all the what could have been there, but it isn't there. So this ending, I mean, it's fun and all, but once again, like I've mentioned many times before, there's a bunch of emotion just missing here that I feel is kind of needed for a movie like this, where you have close family members that die, and then you bring them back to life. And then there really is no way. That probably might even be due to the fact that the actor that plays Lewis here is not doing that great of a job, and maybe that could have been done to the fact that he wasn't giving much to work with. Yeah. Who knows? There could be multiple reasons here, but I don't think that the way that Lewis has acted here does a very good job at portraying very much emotion, especially for what you would assume from a fatherly role here.
And just in case you weren't ready to get off the emotional roller coaster, cut to credits with a rock song by the Ramones?
Oh, yeah. This was bad. This ending song is the complete tone shift from what we just witnessed. It hurts almost.
It does. It was such a hard tone shift. And apparently Stephen King loves the Ramones, and like one of the producers was like, "Hey, Stephen King loves you guys. You guys want to write a Pet Sematary song?" And I think the song talks about the Pet Cemetery or something. Yep. And then just, no, this is not. We needed something really somber here at the end, probably. Or just something, I don't know what, because the movie's so cheesy with Lewis screaming, cut to black. Right. What do? I don't know. I guess the Ramones is the only thing you can do. So,
right. Yeah, that's the 80s, I guess, for this movie. I wonder if they had followed the book almost to a T for this ending. If maybe playing through the credits, at least the initial credits, before the rolling ones, if they played just silence and just had nothing there, I think maybe that would have helped settle in the weight of this movie. But I mean, they don't do that. They do kind of their own thing here. They kind of they have more of a makeshift ending than anything else. So yeah, I mean, having music here definitely is totally fine, even with this ending. But this kind of music, I don't know about that. It's a pretty interesting choice that they make.
Yes, for a good. Oh gosh. Okay, I'm not gonna say it. It's too much of a spoiler. I don't want to spoil it, but let's just say Alan and I have seen movies recently, one nominated for Best Picture of the Year, that deals with this subject matter and music in a good way that does really let you feel the impact.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, Alan knows what I'm talking about. If you go watch all the Best Picture ones so you can figure it out for yourself.
Yep, it's a secret.
Secret for now. You'll figure it out.
That's such a vague secret, too.
It is. So, Alan, what is your rating and recommendation for Pet Sematary?
Well, amidst some well-done atmosphere towards the end, especially with this sitting on the side of the grave with the sun, which is easily the best shot in the whole movie, Pet Sematary doesn't really hold up very well, in my mind. There are a lot of things that just don't make any sense. Pascal could be completely written out and not really change much, aside from maybe the opening with the dad. The dad's doctorly role is only referenced like once or twice, and that's really about it. Their maid is only in one prominent scene, and then she dies for whatever reason. They kind of explain, but they don't really do a very good job at explaining it. Judd is probably the best acted character here, but like with him and a lot of other things in this movie, there could have been so much more emotion put into it, or really even just diving deep below just the surface level of life and death. I think it would have made this movie so much better, or at least a lot more engaging. So at the end of the day, it's not good. I guess I can't say I was bored by it, because I wasn't, but at the same time, it is a movie that I would not like to return to in the future, because I have a feeling it would bore me. And aside from that, it is extremely cheesy and has the 80s wrapped around its finger. And I mean, to be fair, that is kind of unavoidable in some scenes. But at the end of the day, no, I don't think it's good. I'll give it a 4 out of 10 and a definite not recommend.
Stephen King's Pet Sematary is a decent beat-for-beat adaptation of his source material. If you haven't read the book, don't care to read the book, and you want the Pet Sematary experience, it's all right here in a nice, neat package that won't even take up 2 hours of your day. King's book is nowhere near his longest written, but King does a fantastic job of putting the characters and thematic elements first, and the horror aspect comes as a necessary outcome of their choices. For instance, Gage's death doesn't happen till well over page 300, which is over halfway in the book, and by that point his death hits you like a bag of bricks. I will say the location, set design, and makeup are quite well done, and a few certain scenes are transported from page to screen, and not to mention Zelda is unforgettable. While this film begins strong, it quickly falters into a briskly paced story that forgets to develop the characters. I'm disappointed with the lack of connection we're not given to deal with these characters and the traumatic events they go through. I don't feel the weight of Lewis's decision to resurrect Gage, nor do I feel the anxiety of the pressure mounting on the family as they blindly go towards impending doom. Performances are mostly weak, especially coming from Dale Midkiff, whereas Fred Gwynne gives the strongest performance, and the one most like his character from the book. I understand certain elements have to be changed when bringing the story to the big screen. I'm just disappointed this film lacks a heart. Pet Sematary receives 5 stars out of 10, with a mild not recommend.
One interesting thing that I guess I forgot to mention earlier is in both Missy's hanging scene and then later with Mom's hanging scene, more prominent with Missy, You do see the rope around her neck, but you can totally tell that it's being strapped to a harness behind her. Just wanted to mention that. I thought I saw it on my viewing, and I was like, aha.
Great.
So you can totally tell it's fake. Plus, I don't think the neck hangs down when you hang somebody. It's like more like this, but that's just me.
One thing I forgot to mention is when Lewis walks into the house and he sees everything like decrepit and old, like goo all over the walls. I felt like I just walked into Troll 2.
Oh, that's a compliment. I could see some Silent Hill-y vibes from it, but for like 3 seconds. I do see Troll 2 in it, though. I guess I can see that. Yeah. That's not a very big compliment, though.
No. Well, it's a compliment deserving of that element of the movie, I feel. Or
Fair
put
enough.
down, whichever way you take it. I don't know, you can take it both ways, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, listeners, thank you so much for joining us on our review of Pet Sematary. Don't worry, we will be reviewing not Pet Sematary 2. I'm glad we're not wasting our time on that. We will be reviewing the new 2019 Pet Sematary, which I hear more recently is going to be rated R, of course, I would hope. So I hear it's going to be pretty...
Yeah, I hope they don't go for a PG-13 because 9 times out of 10, those don't usually work. There are very few exceptions. Oh,
no, absolutely. This would not work as a PG-13 movie. It would be crappy. It's got to be R. Sorry, you got to judge it based off the source material and the themes and situations they're going for. And this is an R-rated movie. So it is going to be rated R. I'm looking forward to seeing what they do. Based upon the trailers, it looks pretty good. And I have faith Jason Clarke is going to be much better than Dale Midkiff. Everybody just looks much better. This whole movie looks to be a bit more top-notch, and it looks like it's drawing from some much creepier horror movies that we've seen recently, and we've had a pretty good run of horror atmosphere. Now, whether those stories necessarily pay off, at least the atmosphere is there.
Yeah, I will say this, in the recent years, especially the last about 2 or 3, horror is kind of making a comeback, especially with like movies like Get Out, Hereditary was a big hit too. Movies like that tend to be a lot, I guess, better in terms of filmmaking than in years past, at least like more recent years past.
Yes, and although I didn't like Hereditary and The Witch, they still had a really strong atmosphere.
Yeah.
So, and Get Out has a strong atmosphere as well. And I'm looking forward to seeing Us, but we're not reviewing Us. That's just something we'll watch on our own time.
Yes.
But nevertheless, we will be coming back with a little bit more horror for you, or thriller, or mystery. I don't know. Maybe it's all three with M. Night.
It's a mixed bag.
Yeah. With M. Night Shyamalan's The Sixth Sense, the movie that put him on the map. The movie for his third, sort of fourth movie, that took him to the Oscars, actually.
Yep. And that's next week, so I'm pretty excited to be talking about that. Because I watched it 3 years ago. And I haven't seen it since then, so we'll see if my thoughts have changed since I last watched it.
I have a little bit of a story associated with The Sixth Sense that maybe you can relate, listeners. Don't watch it when you're like 12. It'll give you a little bit of a nightmare. So, well,
I mean, it is PG-13. So, what were you doing watching a PG-13 movie at the age of 12?
I learned my lesson. You wait on those till you're 13, till you can handle it. If you're on the cusp, don't even try. So,
yeah, if you're a second before, and once you're a second past the date you were born, then you're perfectly fine.
I learned my lesson. I'll relate to you my horrifying Sixth Sense experience next week when we do that review. So I'm looking forward to telling you that story. Oh dear. So if that's anything, listeners, don't watch The Sixth Sense with your kids, okay? It's a little heavy. But yeah, after The Sixth Sense, we'll be following that up with Shyamalan's next film, Unbreakable, which, surprise, is actually the first installment in a trilogy nobody knew we were getting or wanted.
Yeah, a very unexpected trilogy that just kind of came out of nowhere, really.
Speaking of trilogies, we will be finishing, after Unbreakable, the original Mad Max trilogy with Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, but then we will be jumping into the quadrilogy aspect of it with Mad Max Fury Road. So if that was confusing, I wasn't meant to be confusing. it's going to be Sixth Sense, Unbreakable, Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, and then Mad Max Fury Road to finish that back up. Then we'll jump back into Shyamalan and start up some new retrospective series. So I'm looking forward to all of those.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And right after we do, I guess, our third round of M. Night Shyamalan, we have a little thing called Back to the Future, I believe, is next. So, pretty excited.
Yeah, Alan is a huge BTF fan.
Yes,
I think.
I have the trilogy on Blu-ray. I bought it recently, actually.
Well, Alan, thank you for joining me on this podcast.
Sure thing.
All right, listeners, thank you for joining us as well. We love talking about movies, and we love talking about them with you. If you enjoyed this podcast, please let us know. Give us a rating. Give us a 5-star rating. It really does help us get noticed by other people who do want to find a fun time listening to us talk about movies and then talking about it with us. So always comment down below your thoughts, what you thought of our thoughts, and we want to hear your thoughts as well and engage with you. So make sure to like, subscribe, share with your family and friends. Check in the description below, so that'll give you all the links to our website, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. You can go through those as well. And if you go through the website, you can subscribe through email, so every Friday you will never miss a beat. Once again, listeners, thank you so much. And if you do want to keep this podcast free, head on over to our Patreon page. That's in the link as well. For the price of a Starbucks cup of coffee, you get a lot of great content, such as bonus podcasts, commentaries, Q&A, our thoughts on the latest movie news and trailers. You get to keep that. The Starbucks cup of coffee, you drink and it's gone. This is yours to keep. So we really do help. That does help us keep the lights on here and helps keep these episodes free for you to listen to. So thank you so much, listeners. We do appreciate it. We will see you next week with The Sixth Sense.